Good evening, everyone. My name is Amanda Green Hawkins, and I am the Director of the Civil and Human Rights Department for United Steelworkers. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. In honor of Asian American Pacific Islander Heritage Month, we are hosting this panel in conjunction with members of AAPI, excuse me, here in Pittsburgh. And the seminar is called Building Solidarity to Combat Anti-Asian Racism, Strategies for Fostering Inclusive Workplaces and Unions, And our moderator will be Chelsea Engel. Chelsea is a member of Local 3657, and she serves on the board of Pride at Work Pennsylvania. She is also the Steelworkers representative on the Pride at Work National Executive Board. Chelsea, thanks for doing this tonight.
Thank you. Like Amanda said, I serve on the board of Pride at Work PA. Our chapter has been working with APALA and other AFL-CIO affiliates more closely in recent months because it will take all communities coming together to get us where we need to go as a country. And tonight, this conversation is part of that movement. So we're joined by several activists tonight, including Sabrina Liu. Sabrina works as a campaigner and researcher in the USW's Strategic Campaigns Department. She serves on the National Executive Board of APALA and is also the president of the Pittsburgh chapter of APALA. We also have here with us Christina Romines, the Economic Justice and Capacity Building Director of APALA, and as well as the Institute for Asian Pacific American Leadership and Advancement. Christina works to foster the growth, sustainability, engagement, and effectiveness of APALA's network of chapters and pre-chapters across the country. Prior to joining APALA, she coordinated the field operations for several national women's organizations. And then last but not least, we're joined by the former national president of APALA, Maria Soma. Maria is the current organizing director for the USW. She has a long history with organizing, starting with when she was a teenager. She spent a summer at a women's peace encampment on the outskirts of London next to a US airbase stocked with nuclear weapons. And then as a student activist and community organizer with low-income families before she became a union organizer. So thank you, all three of you, for taking time out of your busy schedules, and I know they're busy, to help guide us through this very important conversation on how allies can combat anti-Asian racism in our workplaces and our unions. So I'm now going to pass the mic to Sabrina, who's going to tell us a bit about her personal story as an immigrant and let us know about APALA's work. So I'll also be sharing the screen shortly. We have some slides, but yeah, I'll pass it over to you, Sabrina.
Thank you so much, Chelsea. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here with us tonight. So I personally first got involved in the labor movement because of one bad experience with a boss. Years ago, an employer retaliated against me for speaking up on the job, and they decided to hold my visa hostage. And for that, I became undocumented for 9 months. And that made me realize what an imbalance of power looks like in the workplace. And so I decided to stand with working people in underserved community to fight for dignity on the job. And my union, United Steelworkers, and APALA, the Asian Pacific American Labor Alliance, are the places where I focus that energy to build up worker and community power. So APALA, or the Asian Pacific American Labor Alliance, is one of the 6 AFL-CIO constituency groups under our labor federation. APALA was founded in 1992, and APALA has many chapters across the country, and it's really about advancing workers and immigrants' rights through collective power. And in my volunteer work at APALA's Pittsburgh chapter, where I live, I have seen restaurant workers dealing with hostile work environment, being on the receiving end of racial slurs on the job. And I've seen Muslim workers being denied opportunity to pray during work hours. And so I appreciate all of you being on the webinar with us today. because to me, it's so important to have this conversation. And it's important that we identify how racism shows up, how it affects us all, and what we can do about it. Turn it back to you, Chelsea.
Sure. I don't know if people can see even the screen. I'm not used to doing this. If you can see some of these slides. So I believe next we're going to turn it over to Maria. Obviously, as the former president of APALA, you have a lot of experience with this topic and with organizing, since you are also our organizing director. So are you able to talk about why this work matters from an organizing perspective? You're on mute.
Thank you. Sorry about that. Thanks so much, everyone. It's great to be here. Why it matters, because a lot of our, at least in America, we're lumped in as Asians. And so I'm Vietnamese by birth, came over when I was 5, was adopted by a white American family. And so my experience is very different than the one that Sabrina described. And as you meet more Asian folks around this country, everybody has their story. But the one thing that unites all of us is that we're workers. We're workers. And so the idea of being able to address issues in a place where a lot of us spend a majority of our time throughout the day in a 24-hour period. Some of us spend a minimum of 8 to probably 12 to 16 hours a day at work. And so that's a majority of our day. And that's the one thing that unites us, is that we are all workers. And the beautiful thing about being in work and in these workplaces is that most of us then are eligible for collective bargaining. And collective bargaining is leveling the playing field. So it's really important to think about our experiences as Asians in this country, our experiences as Asian workers in this country, and then our experience as Asian worker unionists in this country. And I think that, the idea around APALA and what's happening there is the combination of community, of workplaces, and outside community organizations all coming together to support those of us in all of our different cultures and all of our different workplaces. And that's really vital to know. On a personal note, I've been blessed to be able to have had great jobs. As a working adult, I have only been an organizer. And so most of my life has been spent talking to workers and talking to people about their experiences. And so I think it's really important to listen to people's stories. Everybody has a unique story. It's important that as we listen to them, we find some common ground where we can come together and work. And that common ground will be the issues that we face, be it racism, be it employer issues, be it community issues, be it politics. The places that we can come together and deal with each other in spaces that organizations like APALA provide, and unions like the United Steelworkers provide, where we can address all these issues, is just so vital. It's really vital. And I'm grateful to be here tonight to be able to talk about that space in either union organizing or the APALA space or the community space, where we can come together and actually find real community with each other.
Thank you. And one of the things you mentioned is kind of one of the topics we're going to talk about next. You mentioned how a lot of AAPI people, tend to all be lumped together. It's like you're just Asian, right? But there's so much diversity in your community. So we're gonna kind of address that now. Christina, you're going to talk with us about who AAPI workers are and a little bit about how anti-Asian racism shows up, because especially for those of us who are not Asian American or Pacific Islander, we have to know when we see it so we can call it out. So yeah, I'll pass it over to you.
Thank you. Yeah, so I prepared some slides for this. So as the fastest growing working age population in the United States, Asian American and Pacific Islander workers will be a driving force in advancing the labor movement and political power broadly in this country. So I think the last time I checked, the API population is currently around 24 million. I think that was in 2021. And what's notable is this population in the US doubled between 2000 and 2019 and is projected to surpass 46 million by 2060. So we're a significant part of the population, and we're a growing working age population, which means that it's going to be really important to include Asian American and Pacific Islander workers in our organizing campaigns going forward. The other thing I wanted to call attention is what our other speakers have been saying, is that this is a group of people who are very diverse. We come from many different countries. We speak over 100 languages and have, over 50 different ethnicities that are included in this grouping of people. So that just again shows how diverse we are. I wanted to share a little bit of AAPI labor history as well on the next slide. So the foundations of AAPI history broadly, to me, are rooted in work and labor. AAPI workers are critical to struggles for better working conditions as diverse as railroads and farms, canneries, garment factories, hospitality hospitals, and in tech. At the end of the 19th century, AAPI workers began organizing after facing abhorrent working conditions, unfair wages, and difficulties providing for themselves and their families. So just to give a selection, I guess, of that history. In 1867, more than 5,000 Chinese workers went on strike to demand treatment equal to their white counterparts during the construction of the Central Pacific Railroad. In 1946, nearly 26,000 sugar plantation workers in Hawaii went on strike for nearly 3 months. The strike, which consisted primarily of Japanese and Filipino workers, was significant because it demonstrated that plantation workers could successfully reach across ethnic backgrounds to oppose plantation owners. And this collective action laid the foundation for multi-ethnic organizing in Hawaii for years to come. And so those are just two examples that I find very inspiring from this history. But of course, there are many more, as well as many contemporary campaigns as well. Next slide, please. So despite this legacy of worker organizing in the United States, Asian Americans have experienced anti-Asian racism from throughout the American labor movement. So former AFL President Samuel Gompers advocated for the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act, which set the foundation for immigration exclusion and exploitation today. And Vincent Chin's murder in 1982 at the hands of 2 white auto workers was fueled by anti-Japanese rhetoric from auto executives scapegoating Asian Americans for industry layoffs. And of course, contemporarily in the past few years, many leaders have blamed China and Chinese Americans, or those who appear Chinese presenting, for the COVID-19 pandemic, contributing to the sharp rise in racist harassment and attacks on Asian Americans. And so I also, on the next slide, wanted to take some time to talk about some specific ways that stereotypes show up specifically against how racist stereotypes show up for Asian Americans in particular, because I think it's easy for us to say we're in this together, but maybe we don't exactly understand each other's struggles. And so thank you all for being here today to learn. So the first of these 3 common examples is the so-called model minority stereotype. This is one of the most pervasive and harmful assumptions about Asian Americans, and it holds that Asian Americans are a uniformly high-achieving racial minority that has assimilated well into American society through hard work, obedience to social customs, and academic achievement. This stereotype creates a division between Asian workers and other racial minorities, further downplaying the role of racism in class inequities. And so one of the ways that we can counter this is with disaggregated data, which recognizes the diversity within the Asian American community. So it is not, like crazy rich Asians, but also there are specific populations from Southeast Asia, from the Pacific Islands, who we don't even see their struggles at all because they're being obscured in the story that the aggregated data is telling. The other stereotype I wanted to talk about is the perpetual foreigner stereotype. So this stereotype casts Asian Americans as fundamentally foreign individuals who will never fully assimilate into American society. So for example, even second, third generation Asian Americans are frequently asked where they are from or told that they speak English surprisingly well. As we have seen with the murder of Vinta Chin and the recent spike in anti-Asian hate, messages like anti-China rhetoric that fuels nationalism by labeling entire countries as enemies or dirty and scapegoats them for health pandemics or economic downturns must be stopped. So the perpetual foreigner is like a specifically very othering way to viewpoint on the stereotype. The last stereotype I wanted to talk about is the gendered racism that shows up for our communities. So like other communities of color, Asian Americans are also targets of gendered racism. While Asian American women are viewed as sexually desirable, exotic, and passive, while Asian American men are often seen as effeminate or asexual. These stereotypes create perceptions that Asians are disposable or easy targets and contribute to violence against our communities, such as the March 16 shootings in Atlanta massage parlors that resulted in the death of 6 Asian women workers. However, not all racism appears hateful. When people, especially leaders, reinforce these stereotypes through quote unquote jokes or compliments, we're still contributing to the climate that leads to violence against Asian Americans. So I hope that was helpful. All 3 of these stereotypes, in essence, rely on the idea that Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders are a monolithic group. But that's far from the truth. Asian Americans actually have the widest income gap of any racial group, with workers who are overrepresented at both the lowest and highest end of salary and wages. So now that we've learned these things, I will turn it back to, I think, Chelsea to talk about what the role of unions is in combating this.
Yeah, so we would like to talk about kind of how we can take everything that we've already learned, take it to our unions, both locally and at our international unions, and what we can propose that they do to tackle this racism. So I think, Christina, we're actually going back to you for this first slide of suggestions, which is related to collective bargaining.
Awesome. Yeah. So some suggestions here. So as I mentioned, comments or jokes that scapegoat, stereotype, and dehumanize countries or people by ethnicity are harmful. So making sure that we have provisions to address even jokes. Next, we want to create structures to develop a political analysis of anti-Asian racism and build unity against structural racism. Next, we want to create and enforce anti-discrimination policies and hold people accountable to those policies with their words and actions. Next, we want to ensure that there are mechanisms for union staff, members, and leadership to file complaints under your developed code of conduct. And then we want to use collective bargaining to address racism and xenophobia in the workplace. So some of those ideas could be establishing language to advance fair pay, non-discrimination protections, equity in hiring and advancements, protections from immigration enforcement, and more.
And this next slide, I believe, Sabrina, you're going to talk about language access and a few other things, correct?
Yeah, thanks, Chelsea. Yeah, so Christina, what Christina talked about is like, don't discriminate, don't be xenophobic, right? And things that you could do to include in the policy or language in your workplace. But what about actually making sure everyone is in? So we're the labor movement, we're the union. And in the union, our power comes from our members, right? And we're stronger when we engage our members, whether it's to enforce our contract through a grievance or to put pressure on our employer to win a fair contract. But people don't just magically get involved for no reason. Like our members need information before they will take actions. People need to know what they should care about and why they should care. And my job as a union campaigner, I hear people say stuff like, you know, people on the second shift just don't pay dues, or like members in this and this department never show up to the picket line. Well, what if no one ever explained to folks on the second shift what a union is and why are they paying dues and what dues are for? Or what if no one talked to certain departments about what we're fighting for in a contract negotiation or how those issues will affect them? So in the workplace, in a union, we really need to have the right messenger to effectively communicate with every single one of our members. And there are a lot of factors to consider when you're thinking about who makes the right messenger, right? It could be different departments, it could be different shifts, it could be age, it could be hobbies, like people who play Xbox together. It could be gender identity, it could be race, ethnicity, cultural background, or it could be language. And I can't tell you how many times I've heard union members say, well, you have to speak English to get a job here. Or like, oh yeah, they speak English. Like, why wouldn't they, right? Everybody speaks English here. And just assume that English should work as a way to communicate. I can tell you English is my second language, and I've worked in the United States for 14 years. But if I see a flyer on the wall and it's in English, I usually just ignore it. And if I see something, a flyer on the wall, and it's in my native language, which is Mandarin, I can get the gist of what the flyer wants to tell me in 3 seconds. And I also know that someone, for some reason, is trying to catch my attention and trying to reach me. And so in the union setting that we live in, sometimes we even talk about concepts that are rather complicated. I mean, yes, people probably need to speak English to be hired, but in your workplace, people, you know, in many cases speak English on the job, but it doesn't mean that they will understand in English what collective bargaining agreement is, or grievances, or arbitration, or, you know, complicated language issues that are in your contract. So what you see on the screen are some examples of brochures that were actually used in actual contract negotiation campaigns in labor unions. And the local unions handed out these brochures about how bargaining works, to get people to first understand the process so that they know where they can plug in and how they can get involved. And the brochure here you see on the screen is in Swahili. So when the local hand out information about how bargaining works, they hand out this brochure in both English and Swahili. And sometimes we do this and it's rather symbolic and trying to show that we're communicating. So like the one in top left corner, the members at that local speak English, Spanish, and Hmong, but people are pretty fluent or actually bilingual in Hmong and English or Spanish and English. So we did not really need to translate everything into different languages, but we're trying to send a message that we're building unity and solidarity across the entire membership. And so in the brochure that they handed out, they had the word unity in English, Hmong, and Spanish. So that really sends a strong message of like, hey, it's contract time, it's important, we're trying to talk to you, and you should care, and here is why. Chelsea, if you could go to the next one. So in order to build stronger union power where you involve every single one of your members, first you need to just get to know your members. And sometimes that means getting to know what ethnic background your members come from. Sometimes it's about knowing what language your members speak at home. And think about like translating your contract summary or new hire orientation materials about what union even is into a different language. And think about providing interpretation at important meetings where you're trying to get your members on board or do something, take action. And that's because we have a duty of fair representation. And if you're not communicating to people in ways that they understand, how is that fair representation? And also, we just would not be able to build unity and union power without reaching everyone effectively. So getting to know your members and their needs are just really important. Chelsea?
And I think, Christina, you're going to talk about how unions can support their AAPI members in becoming leaders.
Yeah. So the first thing that folks can do to do that is to sponsor your AAPI members to join APALA. So as Sabrina and Maria have talked about, this is a great time and a great space, especially for AAPI workers who maybe don't know a lot of other folks in the labor movement, don't see a lot of people that look like them. In APALA, we are a group of AAPI workers and trade unionists. And so it's a great space to feel affirmed, but also advance work that's important to you in your community through the labor movement. So, you know, sponsoring members to join APALA, supporting their time, contributing to APALA chapters is another great to also support local communities, especially where you have, you know, locals. Next, we want to support AAPI members to utilize education programs within the union and take on leadership development opportunities. So connecting the opportunities that are in the union with the opportunities that exist within APALA and outside to create a pathway for that leadership. And then finally, making sure your trainings include language translations and flexible scheduling so that everyone can participate in it in the way that it makes sense for them and their lives. I think oftentimes we make an assumption about people not being interested in information when we haven't really questioned how accessible we've made that information to everyone. And so that's just another tip or suggestion that we would like folks to carry with them after today.
Super. And then Maria, I think you're going to talk about how to build AAPI worker power through organizing.
Great, thank you. Yeah, look, the like I said earlier, the one thing that does combine a lot of our communities is the fact that most of us are workers. And so one of the ways to make sure that our voices are heard is to make sure that we are unionizing. And that we are being as inclusive as possible of everything that the previous slide said. So how do we do that? What does that look like? You know, for a lot of our unions, right? We may not have organizers or members who have been developed yet as leaders to be able to go out and assist us in organizing non-union workers. So we want to make sure that what we're doing in certain workplaces where there are, and there's a real difference, right? Where there are more recently arrived immigrants or an immigrant workforce where language and culture are things that you have to take into consideration at that point. You really want to go into those workplaces and you really want to talk to those workers and figure out where do they go for support? Who do they trust in that community? Who has assisted them in ways that the worker or the employer or fellow employees have not? And really in a lot of those places, you can find those different worker centers that specialize in helping recently arrived immigrants. There are lots of community organizations that have been developed over time, certainly in in certain locations where there's a concentration of workers. And then churches, you can go to churches, you can go to certain, like I said, community organizations. Here in the city of Pittsburgh, there was an organizing drive that we were doing, or that we weren't doing, another union was doing, the iron workers. And at that workplace, what they discovered was there were probably 80% Burmese workers there. And so we had to figure out, they came to, I was president of APALA at that time, and I was asked to assist in the city of Pittsburgh. And I said, okay, well, let's find out, first off, what community organizations actually help them, because they're recently arrived immigrants. We found out that a lot of them had been brought over by 2 organizations in this town, and that they had also worker centers and services that they provided these new recently arrived immigrants, which also included job placements. So finding out that information was really important for us to be able to communicate. Then we tried to identify folks that that are the perceived, I say perceived leaders, because oftentimes the person who speaks better English is seen by the outside community as the leader, but it is someone who can assist with the communication. And so we really want to try to find those key organizations, those key places where people gather, and or those key people who can act as an interpreter until you find and meet other people. And so part of doing this really is, when the ironworkers came, it was about really understanding, having the union understand where you needed to go, having the union understand how workers, especially these recently arrived Burmese immigrants, where they went to for help and what type of help that they needed within the community. And then really kind of understanding, what are their, what are they facing at work, and several of these workers were placed in 2 or 3 employers, and these 2 or 3 employers had lots of issues. And so really understanding that. And so what we did was we went to APALA and an APALA activist, and I had them write just exactly what Sabrina said, a book about worker rights in the United States. And we did it in Burmese. There were a couple of other indigenous languages that we had to take into consideration. And so we tried to do the best that we could, and just to explain what their rights were. And then I found someone from APALA who came down to visit with us and visit with them, and really trying to go over this brochure. So really understanding all of that was very important for the iron workers. The other thing that we did then, when we invited our APALA brother in, was we had meetings where we trained them on this book. We did all sorts of stuff. We worked with actually a grocery store where a lot of Burmese went to, who then allowed us to have flyers and stay there and talk to people as they came in and shopped, etc. So we really had to find this avenue. And then when we found the ability to see some community members who would talk to us, we then asked if they would host an event. And so there was a big community potluck hosted at 2 people's houses who were placed in the same apartment complex. And so they really convened the meeting for us and allowed us to meet with the workers in a space that they felt really, really kind of safe. And ultimately, unfortunately, for the iron workers, that drive was not successful. But what it did was really increase the drive, the understanding, and the what's the word I want when I say drive? The enthusiasm that the iron workers had for organizing the Asian community here, the Burmese workers specifically. And then they went off and they hired a Burmese organizer. So things like that, I think, are very, very, very important. And so where do we go? I think that Christina said, this is the one community where you've got such a diverse economic stratus, difference. You've got workers who work in shop floors, who work in restaurants, who work in low-wage jobs. And then you've got people who are faculty members, who are in the tech industry, who, are in some of the higher paid jobs that our economic society has. And so you've got this huge gap. And when you choose to look at industries or sectors where there's a high concentration of AAPI workers, you really need to be thinking about those industries. And they're vastly, or can be vastly different, and your approaches should be vastly different, depending again on the workers that you're talking to. And I think that, again, what I said at the beginning is, the one thing we have all in common, whether you're working at a grocery store or a seafood market, and or a tech entrepreneur, is that we're all workers and we all share some common workplace issues. And so we really want to be taking a look at those common issues, and also at the same time making sure that we're addressing their specific needs in their specific workplaces. So it's hard to say the concentration of workers, Asian workers. They work in so many different industries, and sometimes depending on what organization, again, if they're recently arrived immigrants, where they've been placed by their organization that has helped bring them over and sponsor them in this country. And I'll answer more questions if we have the opportunity for folks, rather than go into, because there's so many different variables. But I would just say that it's worth the effort and time to take it slowly, to do it properly within the community, and to make sure that we're reaching out to as many allies as we can, because they're the trusted folks. And we're not, unfortunately, right now. Unions are not seen as a trusted player in a lot of workers' lives. Their experiences and knowledge about unions vary depending on what country they come from and what sectors that they're in working. So take it slow, make sure we do it properly, because one insult will destroy a campaign. Unfortunately, one misstep will take years to fix at times. And so we want to make sure that we're doing it right.
Yeah, really meeting workers where they are is vital. And then as far as individuals go, right, like the webinar tonight is a great first step for any individual rank and file workers. And we're going to move on. I think, Maria, you're going to talk again here about one of the actions people can take, which we've kind of already talked about, which is to get involved with groups like APALA.
Yeah, look, I've been a unionist for a few decades now, and I was never active in APALA. But when I came to, I represented the USW on APALA's national board, and the first conference I went to, I immediately, in all my years of union, and I'm pretty confident in a lot of different spaces, especially as a first timer. But when I walked into that APALA conference for my first time, I felt immediately at home in the labor movement in a way that I had never felt before, because there were people who looked like me. There were people who thought like me, and they were all Asians from so many different countries, with so many different languages, with so many different cultures. But the beautiful thing was we were in that room because we were trade unionists, and that united us. And so for me, to start an APALA chapter is one of those ways that Sabrina talked about, making people feel welcome and making sure there was inclusivity. APALA does that for Asian unionists in a way that no other organization does. And so for me, join or starting a chapter of APALA is wonderful, and it's a way to really immediately feel a sense of community within the organization. And then the other thing about doing it is not just for us, but APALA's mission is to make sure that we shout from the rooftops, right? All of these things we talked about tonight, that's part of our mission. That's part of our drive. And so part of this about joining APALA or starting a chapter is you're also educating your wider union family, your wider community about what it means. And so I just can't say enough good things about making sure that if you have an opportunity or a desire, not an opportunity, but a desire to join or start a chapter of APALA, reach out and someone will help you start one. I can't say enough good things about that. And then ask your local to pay your membership dues. Ask your local to pay your membership dues. You know, each chapter has a different set of dues. And then there's a national, I think, recommendation. It's been a while since I've seen what APALA's due structure is, but you know, they're not extensive. Oh, there, I'm looking at it now, 35. It's not extensive, and every local, no matter how small they are, can help you if you need help. I don't know if that gets to what.
And I think I'm seeing some folks here with us on the webinar, so I want to point out that we do have Minnesota chapter. We have a number of chapters in California. Christina, I might need help with. We're in California. I know we have Los Angeles, San Francisco, Sacramento, Inland Empire, San Diego, because I know I see some California folks here.
And Sabrina, do you want to maybe even just talk for like a minute or two? Because you started the Pittsburgh chapter. So do you have any advice for folks who there isn't a chapter in their area, they want to start one, but maybe they're not confident, they don't think they can do it, they don't know where to start? What would your advice be?
Yeah, I think so. I started the Pittsburgh chapter here, and it really started by having a lot of one-on-one conversation with people doing social justice work, economic justice work, unionists in labor unions, about whether they are Asian Americans, Pacific Islander, Native Hawaiian or not, about, hey, what are you seeing? What's missing here? What do we need? So conversation like really made me realize that in the area where I live in Pittsburgh, we do not have any Asian American or Pacific Islander group that's looking at the economic justice and social justice of this group of people. And so we in Pittsburgh built a multiracial coalition to start by really two things. One is to support unionizing drives in Pittsburgh. So that goes from university staff and grad student workers and faculty, and there's tech workers, there's museum workers, library workers, and there are Asian American members in all these workplaces. So we support and be vocal about these unionizing efforts in Pittsburgh. And the second thing we did is that we thought about, we looked around and thought about who are the most exploited worker in our community, and where can we find resources for them. So we thought about that. Okay, there's the Restaurant Opportunity Center that is nationwide with a lot of chapters across the country. And in the restaurant industry, there are a ton of wage theft and other cases that's happening, and people are very exploited in the restaurant setting, whether it's front of a house or back of house staff. And there are a lot of undocumented workers, lots of Latino and Asian workers in that industry. And we know that we have natural partner like Restaurant Opportunity Center to lean on. So we also focus on sharing information about wage and hour law, especially in the restaurant setting, but some general wage and hour and workplace law that will apply to anyone who's working in the United States. So that's kind of what we did in Pittsburgh, but APALA chapters across the country take on different issues based on like who you have in the area and what issues there are. And some members work on global solidarity issues as well. I don't know if Christina, you want to highlight any examples of chapter work or like global solidarity efforts?
Yeah, from the global solidarity perspective, I mean, we have a group that meets together from various chapters all across the country who are very interested in international solidarity work, who focus on just different campaigns or priorities. based on what's emergent or what the needs are. So historically, our members have been very interested in the Philippines as a country. Generally, there was recently a murder of a trade unionist over there that we spoke up about. We've been in an ongoing relationship with LRSU, which is a union in Cambodia. And I think our members really enjoy making those connections. We know we're going to have some delegates visiting from other countries at our conventions. And so not only is it a great time to be with other workers who look like you from around the country, but you get to meet people from across Asia and the world as well. And then I think speaking about the chapter specific stuff, I think what's really great about that work is that you get to determine that work, you get to be really meaningfully engaged in what is going on in your community. So for example, I know our Massachusetts chapter has been very engaged in gig worker organizing. Our Philadelphia chapter is actually organizing against development in Chinatown that they're concerned is going to push them out. And I think that's a very interesting and nuanced view that they're bringing to the labor movement, which would traditionally just be interested in the jobs and the growth, right? But we're talking about like the impacts to our communities as well. Another example is our San Diego chapter, obviously because of their location, is very interested in immigration issues and very interested in border issues. And just this last year, we had the opportunity to do a border visit. So we had APALA members from around the country, union leaders from around the country, join our San Diego chapter in seeing what it is like, what the situation is at the southern border, and if there's anything we could do as trade unionists to mobilize to make those changes.
Super. And would one of you like to talk about the upcoming convention in Seattle?
Yeah, so APALA's convention is coming up this summer. It's gonna be August 3rd to 6th in Seattle. So convention is really a great place to build connection with other Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander workers, or find ways and inspirations to build multiracial solidarity within your local, your union, your area of the labor movement. Christina, do you want to talk about the convention?
Yeah, I think you covered it. Typically there is we're passing resolutions, we're electing our new leaders for the next 2 years. We're passing amendments to our constitution. We typically do an action every year. There's typically an awards ceremony where we get to celebrate our leaders and their accomplishments. It really is a fun, affirming, motivational time. And so if you don't have a chapter to connect to, I'm happy to do a one-on-one with anyone to figure out how they can plug in, because I think from APALA's perspective, you know, we're only as successful as like the people who are willing to throw in and say, yeah, I'm an AAPI worker and this issue is really important to me. So yeah, that's just a plug. We're excited to see you there. I don't know if Maria, you wanted to add anything else, because I know you've been to more conventions even. Yeah.
Several. It's been a long time, but I will say this, and that is just a little bit of enticement. We've said it before, our community is not homogenous. There have been many a convention where there have been some heated floor battles on certain resolutions. I've had to chair a few heated floor battles when I was the president. And so the beautiful thing about all of that is that we fight and we grapple because these issues are so important to us. And the idea at the convention, it's been a while since I've been to one, is that when we put something on the floor, people talk, people fight. And so that this isn't just a conference where there's a rubber stamp. It didn't used to be where the floor was a rubber stamp. People will grapple with each other. And you've got the East Coast Chinese women from the UFT fighting with the West Coast, right? SEIUers who are Filipino. And so you've got all these different factions, and it's a wonderful, because then you really get a full idea of the robust conversations, the robust ideas, and where we have common ground and where we don't have common ground. But when we walk out of that room with a resolution that's been voted on, it's a wonderful process, because oftentimes it is heatedly debated. So anyway, it is spicy. I will say that at times. So I encourage you to go for just the joy of being in a room, in a union room, where people still grapple with each other on resolutions. It's wonderful. So
Yeah,
go.
Another thing about convention that I love is that I see some of the webinar attendees here that you're from a very diverse local union. Some may not be. For some of us, you may be the only single Asian or Asian American or Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander in your local union or in your area. And you may not see people who look at like you in the representation of the movement around you. And it can be so empowering to meet other union activists in the movement and build some connection. And another thing I really like about APALA Convention is the workshops. So the workshops, like, getting to meet people, learn new ideas, be inspired to take on future activism, and learn about other best practices in other area that somebody may be already doing that you can borrow from, can be a great way for a local union to build up your activists. You might have a member who, ask questions about the union, but so far they haven't been running for officer or being a steward, because those are really big steps. But APALA Convention can be a great place to send your member to a union function so that they get inspired, fired up, and come back to do more with your local.
Awesome. Of course. I'm sorry. I cannot get my cat to leave me alone tonight. And then Christina, can you talk a bit about how folks can stay informed and educated with different folks that you all have available?
Yeah. So first, I think one way to stay informed is to join our mailing list. So I'll drop. Oh, I see Sabrina's already put it in the chat. So you can subscribe to APALA's newsletter, and that's just a quick way to see what we're doing on a given basis. If you're more active on social media, we're also on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. So that's a quick way to do it. I think another way is to sign up and become a member. And then if you're interested in more of the information and suggestions we were sharing today, I would encourage you to read APALA's Labor Toolkit on Anti-Asian Racism. So it can be downloaded there at the link that was just dropped in the chat. And I'm happy to talk about that more with anyone else, either the information that's in the toolkit or how folks can get plugged into APALA.
Super. And then I'm gonna look at our chat. Let me, I think that was the last official slide. So I will stop the screen share here. I'm just gonna see if anyone had any questions, any Q&A here. If not, I do have one in mind in case. Do any of you have advice for, especially folks who are not in the community and they maybe are uncomfortable with calling out racism when they see and hear it? Because I hear that a lot, is, oh, it's just so it's uncomfortable. Where do you think folks can start, and things that maybe they/we should keep in mind when we hear and see these things?
I think one thing is, if you're like a bystander to racism, or if you're a bystander to anything, there's many ways to intervene. So I think there is that way that we often think that's like, hey, that's not okay, right? It's very direct, it's very overt, right? And I think for some people that works or maybe doesn't work as well. And I think I would just encourage folks to not forget about maybe the person who is like the recipient of the, you know, slight or the attack. And you might just want to check in with them privately, like, hey, I noticed that thing, like, you know, I want to check in how you felt. Like, does it like, is it helpful if I, you know, bring some, like, would you want me to talk to them for you if that's not something you're comfortable with? Or I don't know, sometimes people just want a distraction, like they don't want the attention on them. And so maybe that's another way you can just redirect. I think also not everything needs to be a call out. Sometimes it can be a call in. I think sometimes when people think they're being funny, because, you know, they don't always have a bad intention, but I think sometimes people think they're being funny, and you can just say like, I didn't think that was funny, or I don't get the joke, can you explain it? And then oftentimes they just kind of bumble and lose it. So just not letting a situation sit. So we don't always have to like angrily confront it, but like address it in a way that makes sense and is authentic for who you are.
Yeah, and I also think those are good pieces of advice. I also think that some people are just too scared to confront it. It is so uncomfortable. And the one piece that I would recommend too is that to talk to someone else who may have a little bit, who isn't as nervous about saying something. Or the other thing that I say why you should talk to, or at least report it somewhere, somehow, is because, you know, I think Christina talked about it in the earlier slides. Tracking is very, very important, right? And for us, if it doesn't get reported, then it never happened into the rest of the world. That's our problem, right? It never happened. And so even if the very minimal thing that you do, and it's okay, it's scary, it's really scary, so I get it, but somehow figure a way to make sure it's documented somewhere. The employer, the you know, I don't know if it's the community watch, if you have a community watch, if it's really egregious, to the police, because we need to track what's happening, and we can't stay silent anymore about it. And sometimes it's too scary to do a direct confrontation or even a soft confrontation in that moment, but try not to let the moment go too far without trying to figure out how to document it, so that there are statistics that we can keep and that the government can keep, because those statistics, whether they're important to us or not, they're important to the entities that keep it. And that's the way we get policy change, or the way we get union change, or the way we get contract change, is if we're documenting. So document. That's the one thing I think I would say, add to what Christine said.
So I'm not sure I see any questions. You guys were just so good. You answered everyone's questions without them even needing to ask. And I'll just add, as an ally, I recommend joining APALA, because even if you're not a member of the community, like all marginalized communities, they need allies, and they need the money, let's be honest. Just like Pride at Work, we want allies to join because we need everyone working together. And yeah, we want your money. So, so yeah, everyone, and what's the quote from Bayard Rustin? You have to join every other movement for the freedom of the people. So really, we should be members of every single AFL-CIO affiliate group, in my opinion. And at least here in Pittsburgh, in the very few years Sabrina has started the APALA chapter, she has done so much, made many moves and many connections. So even if you're just a small chapter, maybe you're one person, you can do a lot in your community. So I highly recommend getting involved, and I really appreciate you all taking time out of your night to do this. So if there are no more questions, I will pass it off to Amanda to kind of wrap up the evening.
Thanks, Chelsea. As you all know, I am home, as most of you, and I have children who are just right here, waiting to be seen. Well, maybe I can, because we're always talking about, the work that we do, but we know that it's not just for us. It is for the next generation and the generations after that. So I want to thank you all so much for staying up, being with us past working hours. I know, like Maria said, we are all workers, but we don't work all the time. We work most of the time, but we try not to work all the time. So I thank you so much, Sabrina, Christina, Maria, and Chelsea for doing this. And I thank our attendees for their interest and their engagement. And we hope that we can connect with you so that we can continue the battle, continue the fight to fight racism, period, no matter which group we're talking about. Racism is racism is racism. And the fight has to continue to beat it back. So thank you all.
Thanks, everyone.